Nicholas Royle is Emeritus Professor of English at the University of Sussex. He's the author of many critical works, including on the uncanny, literary theory, and the works of Alain Sixou and Jacques Derrida. He has also published numerous novels, and memoirs, including Mother, a Memoir, and David Bowie, Enid Blyton, and The Sun Machine. He's currently working on 2 projects, a book about Virginia Woolf and Palestine, and a study of the weird, the uncanny, and the new fantastic. Please join me in welcoming him.
I would like to begin by warmly thanking Ellery Watson, both for inviting me to speak here and for suggesting my title, Life Writing and the New Fantastic, Possibilities and Pleasures for Life Writers and Readers. I am also indebted to Ellery for providing the descriptive paragraphs for the event page. I was asked if I was happy with these paragraphs, and I confirmed that I was. When I read over them again in order to start writing, a feeling of mild horror passed through me as I registered how much I was evidently promising to talk about and how much ground I would be covering. This lecture is dedicated to the memory of my brother, Simon Maxwell Onslow Royle, who died in his mid-20s. Today is his birthday. He would have been 66. I'm currently in the midst of writing a book about Virginia Woolf. I suspect that she will slip in. She is the wolf at my door. Around the time she began To the Lighthouse, she wrote a piece entitled How Should One Read a Book?, in which she emphasizes the primacy of pleasure, while also remarking that reading is so difficult that it is doubtful whether anybody knows anything about it. The title of my lecture invites reflection on reading and pleasure in Woolfian ways. I also like the ambiguity of the alliterative couple, possibilities and pleasures. Do they belong together, or are they at odds? I set these questions aside for now and turn to the opening words of the lecture description. Quote, "For many, life writing aims to authentically narrate the real, factual experiences of a life." Close quote. I admire the concision and no-nonsense directness of this sentence. As I say, I didn't write these words. The sentence is not written in what I would venture to call my idiom. For many, life writing aims to authentically narrate the real, factual experiences of a life. For many, but not for all. I cannot include myself in this many for at least 4 reasons. If I said there were 5, it might start sounding like Monty Python's Spanish Inquisition, so I'll keep to 4. First, I balk at the idea of authentically narrating. I am with Theodore Adorno, wary of a jargon of authenticity and how thoroughly the authentic has been co-opted into the services of capitalism. I also think that Jacques Derrida's lapidary words, "I do not seek to establish any kind of authenticity." The idea of authentically narrating has, to my nose, a faint whiff of terror. It reminds me of those authorities in Maurice Blanchot's The Madness of the Day who demand, "Tell us just exactly what happened." And then the narrator's final decisive words, "A story? No. No stories. Never again." Second, I am baffled by the phrase real, factual experiences. Have I ever had one of these? Am I having one at the moment? But then the word real is prudently in quotes, which suggests uncertainty. The scare quotes around real indicate at least the incipience of the unreal or fictive. Third, I would query the importance accorded to intentionality and consciousness in the sentence. Life writing aims, it seeks, it plans, it intends. There's a funny hint of anthropomorphism, as if life writing were a purposive, briskly efficient person. There is also the implication that the factual experiences at issue are conscious. Could one, after all, lay claim to an experience as factual without being conscious? It seems that life writing is about aim and mastery, and there is little space for chance or trance. Finally, I am sceptical of the apparent splendid isolation of a life, as if a life, any life, were not essentially a living with or a living thanks to. There is something of a hysteron, proteron, or cart before the horse about the syntax of this sentence that begins with life writing but ends with the life out of which that life writing purportedly emerges. Is the life not as much a product of life writing as its source? And what do we understand by life? What happens if, for example, as Michael Nass puts it in his book Plato and the Invention of Life, we acknowledge a force of death in life, an originary mourning, a life-death which compromises from the start anything like a pure life or a purely living present. Is there a real factual experience of life writing? Life writing fights for its life in the uncertainties, the possibilities, the pleasures, but also the unpleasures of how to tell a story. It is driven by a desire to tell, while reckoning with the impossibility of an authentic story or narration. It is concerned with the irreducibly strange encounters of fact and experience, and with the irreducible effects of the imaginary and fantastic. Life writing has to do with reverie, the hypnagogic, the unconscious, and unknown. It's about that desirable space of composition that Virginia Woolf evokes in her diary, where the mind works so quick it seems asleep. Life writing contends with chance, the inadvertent and serendipitous, with what is not intended, what cannot be foreseen or expected. E.M. Forster's rhetorical question, voiced by a fictitious aunt, remains sound advice.
How can I tell what I think till I see what I say?
Or, as Ellen Sixu puts it, no other law except the unforeseeable. The forms of life writing are multiplicitous and heterogeneous, not to be programmed. Life writing suffers from, but might also be joyously immersed in, episodes. It entails a thinking and undergoing of the fragmentary. Life writing might take the form of an eccentric dictionary, as readily as a diary or journal. As Laura Marcus notes, the category of life writing suggests a broad and inclusive approach to the study of literature and culture. But life writing does not represent, tell, describe a life that precedes the writing. Life writing is auto-bio-hetero-thanatographical. It involves thinking in mourning, reckoning with life-death, otherness in the heart of the self. The life of life writing is never one's own. It might also be the life of a tree. Eccentric dictionary, did I say? If, like Raymond Williams, I were to put together a book called Key Words, and I confess I daydream about doing so, in part as the result of a long-standing interest in the idea of eccentric kinds of dictionary, and in finding a form in which to assemble and let ramify a verbarium of words or phrases whose neologistic force has preoccupied me over the years, arboreality, away, back, the creatitical, cryptesthetic resistance, the diction array, episodes, flow, foreign body, hydropoetics, hydrology, lingophobia, living backwards, magical shrinking, the mole, the nanoment, nano-thinking, narrative clairvoyance, the narratoid, night writing, omniscience, ornithomorphism, ornithophony, podiatry conversion course, protective mimicry, quick fiction, quilting, reality literature, the retrolexical, side thinking, the sun machine, the telepathology of everyday life, telesthetic communism, twilight, the undermined, upport, veering, word life, the U-turn, and so on. And in part because Raymond Williams feels like a strange semblob or double, not only in terms of our shared commitments to writing fiction as well as criticism, but also in the fact that I live in the same little town on the south coast of England where Williams lived and where he got the inspiration to write his book. It all started, he tells us in the preface to Keywords, when he looked up the word culture in the 13-volume edition of the Oxford English Dictionary in the basement of Seaford Town Library. If, like him, I were to attempt to compile a keywords for the 21st century, it would have to include entries on the uncanny, the weird, and the new fantastic. All dictionaries are eccentric. It is a matter, as Fred Moten puts it, of what it is to taste mass in the heart of eccentricity. So, resisting the niceties of alphabetical order, here are 3 entries for an imaginary dictionary, and then, with luck, before my heart does, I'll stop. The uncanny. As I suggest in a book on this topic, the challenges of thinking about the uncanny start with the. There is no such thing as the uncanny any more than the weird or the fantastic. To speak of the is already to be engaged in a theoretical fiction. In the book, I stress that uncanniness has to do with a feeling that arises in a particular context. It is essentially a reading effect. I borrow this term from Shoshana Feldman's essay on Henry James's The Turn of the Screw. Uncanniness has to do with reading, whether this be a text or a person or a situation or an experience or a memory. An uncanny feeling may entail a suggestion of the supernatural. It is phantom-like, fleeting, a threshold thing, hesitating. You don't simply cross over into the supernatural or religious. It is an experience of wobbling or veering with regard both to the external world and to the self. It's like experiencing a foreign body within. Take, for example, déjà vu. It's a trembling of belief, a momentary suspension of judgment in which we might think to ourselves, surely this can't be happening. But also, if this is happening, who am I? Or, what kind of I can it be to whom this is happening? An uncanny feeling may be disturbing, even frightening. It's never far from madness. It is mostly associated with what is not pleasurable, and indeed often with what is abject, loathsome, traumatic, horrifying. But as I try to set out in the book, the uncanny has strangely positive forms too. For instance, in the uncannily beautiful, in marvellous coincidences, or in the feeling of too good to be true. There are possibilities and pleasures, the pleasure of possibilities, as well as the possibilities of unpleasure. Critics and theorists frequently hasten to refer uncanniness back to the German Unheimlich, especially in relation to Freud's remarkable essay, Das Unheimliche. But the English, or originally Scottish, uncanny is a strange treasure house of its own. The German adjective unheimlich is focused on the Heim, or home, in other words, a dismantling or negation of home, a sense of what is unhomely or not at home, whereas uncanny has to do with that deceptively familiar English word, can. and its undoing. Can is from Old English kunan, to know. Uncanny is a crisis, which may be a temporary paralysis, but also a transformative moment in the possibilities of can, of what we know, of know-how, of what we are able to think knowing means. We sometimes speak of resemblances as uncanny, or again, we may experience as uncanny something familiar becoming suddenly unfamiliar, or vice versa. Or we might find uncanny the abrupt and unexpected exposure of what was supposed to be personal and private. Someone is reading your life writing, for example, your diary or your text messages. An uncanny feeling may generate a crisis of the natural, when what we thought was natural, an object, a landscape, some sound, the light, transpires not to be. Or we might succumb to uncanny uncertainty when something dead or without life comes to life, or conversely when something we assumed was alive isn't. Heidegger compellingly argues that what is ordinary is not ordinary, it is uncanny. The world itself is unheimlich, alien, unhomely. The sense of not at home is how it is. Life writing starts there. And then there are the strange kinds of knowledge and critical reflection afforded by the writings of Freud. The uncanniness of the return of the repressed, trauma, the repetition compulsion and the death drive, the uncanniness of projection, disavowal, and the delusions of narcissism. The uncanniness of psychoanalysis itself in bringing to light aspects of ourselves that could or perhaps should have remained hidden. And the uncanniness of words themselves as peculiar and estranging, the sense that, as Freud puts it, we ourselves speak a language that is foreign. Finally, in any writing about the uncanny, there are questions of address and genre. How does one write about this ghostly thing? In what form? To, of, for whom is one speaking? Whom is not home? The subject seems to summon a veering about between the real and supernatural, life and fiction, the remembered and the imagined, but also between one kind of writing and another, creative and critical, literature and psychoanalysis, fiction and autobiography. In its detailing of traumatic surgery I underwent at the age of 3, in its discussion of my real factual experience of epileptic seizure, in its unfolding of my beliefs, religious or non-religious, in its reflections on movies I've watched, loved or hated, in its focus on my experience as a university teacher, in its account of the minimal but for me vital correspondence I had with Samuel Beckett in the early 1980s, in its exposure and investigation of my relationship with another man who shares my name, as well as a fascination with creative writing and the uncanny, in attempting to inscribe a sense of living with and living thanks to loved ones, such as my children, the book is dedicated to them, and friends, perhaps especially Jacques Derrida. In all of these ways, the book called The Uncanny is concerned with the chiasmus of life writing, inescapably caught up in the uncanny, and the uncanny inextricably entangled in life writing. The Uncanny was published in 2003. It was really good to get that book, as one also says, out of my life. I still recall the intense pleasure and relief of being freed up to write about something else, in the form of a little book about Shakespeare, a man for whom the word uncanny didn't even exist. The earliest recorded appearance of uncanny in its modern sense is in the poetry of Robert Ferguson in 1773. But in truth, even with How to Read Shakespeare in 2005, I couldn't stop. I have never stopped thinking about the uncanny. It has been my fate. It has followed me around like the spaniel in John Webster's The White Devil. Fate's a spaniel, we cannot beat it from us. Over the past 25 years, I have carried on writing about the uncanny, or more accurately perhaps, I have carried on finding it writing about me. One of the earliest meanings of uncanny is unsafe. I love reading books. I'm not interested in going out looking for trouble. On the contrary, I share with M.G. Leonard a deep appreciation and gratitude for the idea that, as I heard her say just the other day, books are an incredibly safe space. But what does Shakespeare make of the word safe? This became the title and focus of my chapter on Macbeth. Think of Banquo, for instance, safe in a ditch. And then in a chapter about the Merchant of Venice, I was struck by how, in the absence of the word uncanny, Shakespeare gives new possibilities and pleasures to the word strange. Parenthetically, I register that I have begun using the phrase possibilities and pleasures as if it was mine. It's like that moment into the lighthouse when a perception is attributed to Lily Briscoe but filtered through the narrator, in which, I quote, one repeats words without being aware any longer who originally spoke them. The book, entitled Quilt, 2010, was published under the category novel, but for me it is no such thing. Quilt is focused on the death of my father and the end of my family. My brother died first, then my mother, then my father. I couldn't write this as a first-person account, it was too overwhelming, so it comes out as a mixed third-person and second-person narrative, in part about my father and the dismal business of clearing and selling the family home, and in part about not clearing the home at all, but filling it up with enormous pools and tanks to accommodate various species of stingrays and eventually a full-size manta ray. Quilt was an 18th century synonym for a manta. An English Guide to Birdwatching, 2017, is a novel, again doubtless miscalled, about a couple of undertakers called Silas and Ethel Woodlock, who retire from Croydon and start living in the house in Seaford, where I still live. The first part of an English guide is called The Undertaking, a reference to the strange but everyday diurnal, nocturnal business of being a funeral director, but also to the sense of undertaking as a literary enterprise or life-writing project. Other characters include at least two people called Nicholas Royle, and there's some play on what is uncanny about that, alongside a more or less non-stop meditation on the uncanniness of birds, from the mythical roc to the ancient Egyptian ibis to the climate emergency herring gull. And I should perhaps also mention that there's a man called Stephen Osmer, a widely admired public intellectual who despises both Nicholas Royles and dies of pleasure as he writes. Hélène Cixous, dreamer, realist, analyst, writing 2020, is about Cixous' uncanny life writing and criticism, including her unparalleled exposition of Freud's Das Unheimliche, fiction and its phantoms. Mother, a memoir, 2020, is about the intolerable, uncanny loss of my mother, who slowly succumbed to Alzheimer's after the early death of her younger son, my brother Simon. David Bowie, Enid Blyton and the Sun Machine 2023 is concerned with uncanniness in relation to music, storytelling, painting, childhood memories, my grandmother, and that's enough. You get the drift. Uncanny Drift is the title of an essay I wrote last year about the experimental photographic work of a Nottingham-based artist called Daniel Rapley. Stop! It's behind you. The weird. Life writing is weird. Life writing should be weird, insofar as it entails aspiring towards what M. John Harrison calls a true idiolect. I'll try to clarify this in a moment. In what I would always hesitate to call a literary context, weird goes back to Shakespeare and beyond. Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles refers to the weird sisters or fairies, and this is echoed in Macbeth where the witches are described as wayward or wayard. The variant spellings in the first folio of 1623 inscribe a force of veering or waywardness in the word. The earliest meaning of the adjective weird, dating back to around 1400, is in relation to fate, having the power to control the fate or destiny of human beings, etc., later claiming the supernatural power of dealing with fate or destiny. In this respect, the spaniel, mentioned a few moments ago, would appear to answer to the name weird as well as uncanny. I'm going to keep flush out of this here if I can. That conflation, weird, uncanny, is implied in the second sense of weird in the OED, that is to say, partaking of or suggestive of the supernatural, of a mysterious or unearthly character, unaccountably or uncomfortably strange, uncanny. Weird, in that sense, first emerges in the early 19th century. The looser, less supernaturally inflected sense of weird as out of the ordinary, coarse, strange, unusual, also dates back at least 200 years. People are weird, and writing is weird. Of course, there is good weird and bad weird, nice weird and nasty weird. And then there is also the sort of weird that insists on not being weird at all. I suspect we can all think of at least one person who isn't happy about being described as weird. Back in the summer of 2024, Tim Walz called Donald Trump weird, and suddenly it seemed there was something that would stick to indicted criminal Teflon man. Trump never laughs, can't form proper sentences, his ideas are ill-conceived, destructive, and frightening. Why would anyone choose someone like that to be the most powerful man on earth? But it quickly became clear that weird was a word that could be batted back. They're the weird ones, Trump declared in an interview with Clay Travis in July 2024, referring to Walz, Kamala Harris, and other Democrats. And then in a nicely theatrical syntactic inversion, he elaborated, "Nobody's ever called me weird. I'm a lot of things, but weird I am not." Sorry, Donald. You are horribly, creepily, skin-crawlingly weird. The difficulty here is the very ease with which weird can be deployed. Everyone is weird. Everyone has a weird of their own. You can see it in others, for example, in a friend or loved one, let alone in a foreign dictator you'd hope for as long as you lived to give a berth at least as wide as his grotesque gilded ballroom. But weird is also something in yourself, an idiomatic thing. To be is to be weird. This formulation echoes something Derrida says in a text called Justices, written near the end of his life in 2003. To be is to be queer. This proposition in turn has to do with idiom, with with being raised in the cult of the idiom, as he puts it, with seeing that the desire for idiom, for a pure idiolect, is a desire for the impossible, while also being the most common thing in the world. Derrida's thinking of queer in Justices, a philosophical essay that is also a love letter to his friend J. Hillis Miller, is drawn out of a reading of what Gerard Manley Hopkins called Inscape. Derrida quotes the letter to Robert Bridges in 1879, in which Hopkins observes that, quote, "It is the virtue of design, pattern, or inscape to be distinctive, and it is the vice of distinctiveness to become queer." In any case, there I was, pottering about with this or that project to do with the uncanny, and more or less every year, from the late 90s to the early 2020s, teaching a semester-long seminar on the uncanny, first at the University of Stirling with my friend and colleague David Punter, then at the University of Sussex, and in the meanwhile, as if behind my back, without my really paying attention, out came the weird. It sprouted, it grew. It was like Japanese knotweed, or John Wyndham's Triffids, or the forest in Blackwood's The Man Whom the Trees Loved. Weird became rife. Weird was everywhere. It came up and enveloped me. In recent years, even some of my oldest friends have been identifying me with weird. It started with Geoffrey Bennington in a short text in 2020 entitled Weird, and then in an essay called Weird Luck, published last year in Textual Practice, Robert J.C. Young claims, I quote, that the weird is really always there with Royle and has never left him. Royle is, he argues, weirdly weird. All of this goes down to the woods today for an awfully big adventure. It leads off into the dream forests of personal writing, a term that Laura Marcus, with characteristic humour and scrupulousness, puts firmly in quotation marks when she invokes, on the first page of her book Autobiography, life writing and the related category, personal writing. While Weird may have had its mass media moment in The Sun in July 2024, it had already been showing up all over the place. It became a strikingly common adjective in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Weird times were upon us. But in terms of a broader 21st century manifestation, weird was first of all a literary phenomenon. Long before the lead up to Trump's catastrophic and uncanny return to the White House, weird was a familiar figure in Anglophonic literary and cultural studies. It might even be suggested that the war, ideological but also real, to bring down the humanities, to degrade or do away with the study of literature, to dismantle wokeness, and to discourage and close down critical reading and critical thinking, a war that is going on all around us, in the UK as well as in the US and elsewhere. This war turns on a weird reaction formation, a reaction formation of the weird, a weird twist in a larger manifestation of the weird. The new weird established itself in the 2000s as an innovative kind of writing, perhaps initially best known through the New Weird anthology edited by Anne Vandermeer and Jeff Vandermeer in 2008, and through the work of writers such as China Mieville and M. John Harrison. Mark Fisher further consolidated its importance, in particular with his slender but influential book, The Weird and the Eerie, in 2016. But then it was only called the New Weird because there was an old weird, a practice of weird fiction associated with Sheridan Le Fanu, Arthur Machen, Blackwood and Lovecraft, among others. Weird today is not just a Janusian thing. It's three-headed. If this leads you to conceive Cerberus, the three-headed dog, as a spaniel, consider yourself lucky. There are worse ways of picturing it. First head. Weird has to do with certain kinds of fiction and other literary writing. Second head. Weird has to do with other worlds, with the representation of the existence of other worlds, or of the impact of other worlds on this world. For example, we might think of, say, Blackwood's The Descent into Egypt, 1914, or Lovecraft's The Colour Out of Space, 1927. But then lately, there is a third head, emerging out of an unprecedented sense of our world today, as having become weird, and of the pressures on contemporary writing that go with it. That is to say, the weird has now become as crucial for life writing as it once was for fiction. To illustrate this, I turn to M. John Harrison's Wish I Was Here, 2023, perhaps the most provoking example and exploration of life writing in English, published in recent years. Wish I Was Here is what Harrison calls an anti-memoir, and it pivots on the weird, a word on which he duly bestows a capital W. The weird is a way of writing about the real, he declares. He goes on. The weird is not Lovecraftian. It does not belong to H.P. Lovecraft. Neither is it a subset of the Gothic. It is not the same as Freud's uncanny. It does not belong to the set of genre-adjacent sui generis, and it is not, as some affirm, a wholly political position. In each and every case, it should be a true idiolect. The weird is not a genre in itself, it is a process. It is also an emergent quality which somehow precedes every combination of events, forms, genres, and skills it can be said to emerge from. You can either do it or you can't. Good luck with planning to be weird. See you at the ceremony. End of quote. We may wish to query some of these claims. The denial of the Lovecraftian doubtless depends on how one reads Lovecraft. Likewise, the Gothic and Freud's uncanny. And what Harrison means by wholly political position is somewhat unclear. His remark about striving for true idiolect, it should be a true idiolect, is an affirmation of the singular, even or especially if we ourselves speak a language that is foreign. Any life writing worthy of the name involves a kind of signature, almost inimitable, though never absolutely demonstrably authentic. Everyone has a verbarium of their own, whether they know it or recognise it or not. If we go along with this thinking of idiolect, it will in turn inflect any conception or practice of political writing. Harrison is evidently gesturing towards the weird terrain of a personal writing. He is concerned to differentiate what he is doing from the ostensibly more thoroughgoing politicisation of the weird in the work of Mark Fisher. Trying to put his finger on the weird in a blog in 2006, Fisher writes, "The world is no longer ours anymore. It no longer coincides with itself. It has been estranged. The political, philosophical implications are clear. There is no world. What we call the world is a local consensus hallucination, a shared dream." End of quote. The weird is a form and force of resistance to what Fisher calls capitalist realism. For Harrison, on the other hand, the weird is about what emerges. You can't plan it, it has to do with the unforeseeable. And then this weird is at heart a form of life writing, however cryptic or demonic, as he goes on to make clear. Quote, "Weird, a word so haunted, so transformational, so transitional, that the moment you type it, your soul is sucked through it and into communication with and exile from everything. Everything being the truth about the world in the sense that it is the world. The truth about the world being that it's everything in the world. And though you were always in the world, now you are in there with it, which is a different matter altogether." End of quote. Harrison thus foregrounds a weird space that poses the strangeness of the world along with the need for a creative and critical thinking that acknowledges we have been swallowed up by that strangeness. The weird is post-structuralist in the sense that the structures are all exposed and open to being transformed. I am thinking here, for example, of the perception and experience of structure that is so compactly figured in Natasha Brown's book, Assembly. It is the slave and sugar money, that, as Harrison suggests in Wish I Was Here, so-called Great Britain's so-called greatness was built on. The bones are all laid bare, the story's fallen apart. Make nowhere great again, it all grates terribly, it's all done. The world has become weird. It is a matter of global weirding. This was originally Hunter Lovin's neologism for global warming, the new reality of climate change. As Timothy Morton suggests in Dark Ecology, ecological awareness is weird. We are confronted today with a previously disavowed or unthought weirdness, as Morton calls it. Everything has weirded. Melanie Benson Taylor encapsulates this in her recent study, The Weird South, Ecologies of Unknowing in Post-Plantation Literature. Quote, as a concept in the burgeoning conversation about anthropocenic disaster and climate emergency, the weird is a powerful way to conceptualize not just human hubris, but also humility. We are no different from, no more powerful than, any other living or inanimate objects. Neither the organisms that take up residence in our bodies, nor the myriad things that we imagine we create, fashion, patrol, and control. Weird is the world of climate breakdown, misinformation and fake news, mass species extinction, obscene imbalances of wealth and poverty, insane nationalistic and xenophobic violence, genocide meticulously, incessantly performed in front of our eyes, toxic masculinity, and so many other old-new manifestations of misogyny, racism, homophobia, and transphobia. Weird is also the eerie leveller, whereby humans become, in Taylor's phrase, no different from, no more powerful than, any other living or inanimate objects. The world has become irretrievably weird, and writing about it, writing in it, has been subject to the weird turn. Every one of us is a weird turn, intern. I've been waiting all day to say. Perhaps the most spectacular, uncertainly transformative dimension of contemporary weird writing is in AI. I open ChatGPT and type in the question, what does Nicholas Royle say about the weird? I won't trouble you with the reams of information and misinformation, speculation and misconception this vomits up in about 3 seconds. The era of reaching out is also the era of retching up. Nor is there time to elaborate further here on the weirding of the concept of writing as such over the past 50 years and more. Let me merely gesture towards a fuller exploration by observing that, a bit bizarrely, there is no French word for weird other than the English word that is French, namely bizarre. On the back cover of the first French edition of Grammatology in 1967, Derrida sums up his book in just 8 words. Ce livre est donc voué à la bizarrerie. This book is then dedicated to the bizarre. A new perspective on deconstruction. Deconstruction is weird, dedicated to the weird, weirdly devoted to weirdness. As Geoffrey Bennington comments, for Derrida it could be said that all events are weird, starting with the thought of the trace that weirds the metaphysics of present. One final remark before stepping off this raft called the weird, on which I feel I've been veering about rather precariously for the past several minutes. The weird has the appeal of a certain looseness. Anything and everything can be kinda weird. So it can be fun, a source of pleasure as well as disquiet and dislocation. but vigilance is in order too. In the opening pages of The Weird and the Eerie, Mark Fisher refers in a slightly sniffy way to the wider predilection for the unheimlich. But if weird has displaced the uncanny to become a more prominent key word for our time, we shouldn't suppose we get to leave the uncanny behind. There's plenty of life left in that strange unconcept, to recall Annelene Machelin's term for the uncanny or unheimlich. Starting with the need to think through the negative that is inscribed in the suffix un, the uncanny challenges us to stay critically thoughtful and reflective in a way that the weird is perhaps less inclined to. The new fantastic. Virginia Woolf is preparing to write in her diary, to go down step by step into that queer region, alert as in a dream to the curious plums, things falling unexpectedly. Preparing to write, already writing, already with thee. Those three words in Keats's Ode to a Nightingale affirm the force of the new fantastic. Here is an excerpt from Hélène Cixous's Twists and Turns in the Heart's Antarctic, in Beverly B. Brahick's translation, published in English in 2014. It's from a passage about the dreamer of literature. Quote, sometimes one goes mad, breaks into a gallop, tears off one's clothes, pushes back one's chair, just when everyone is sitting down together at the table. One takes to the road, which is so empty one ought to be suspicious. A few metres on, they set us down in front of an immaculately white, high wooden gate that should in itself be a warning. The person on duty opens it a crack, curiosity gets the better of us, and leads us beyond the few thoughts that might restrain us, might remind us that dinner is on the table. One enters and one is amazed to discover a veritable counter-city, a whole neighbourhood of lovely white buildings, small in size. To our left are houses in the style of miniature Greek temples with colonnades. Everything is closed up tight and seems to be asleep. It is elegant and calm. Writing this, I sense it is the land of the dead and I don't know it. One enters on tiptoe, and just inside are several little closed-up buildings with glass facades and texts I can't decipher, but that seem to originate with travel agencies. One watches the man who let us in out of the corner of one's eye, for one is afraid that he might leave and bolt the high white gate. I take a few more steps. I would like to visit this sleeping neighbourhood. Then at a movement of the gatekeeper, I throw myself quite literally outside, for fear he will shut me in for good. Only then do I see that I was really alone and unconscious in the neighbourhood of Silence Heights. I pause the quotation there. What is this? It's dinner time. It's like a lucid interval, but mad. Are you following? Sarah Wood remarks of the experience of reading Cixous, one understands as one goes, as in dreams. Sometimes one goes mad. Is this the me, or is it you? There is the writer. We know this because she says, writing this, I sense it is the land of the dead. But the writer doesn't know. It is the land of the dead and I don't know it. This dreamer in literature is one enters on tiptoe, and many. Curiosity gets the better of us. Is Cixous recalling a dream in the present tense, or a hallucinatory episode just before dinner? Or is this passage happening only as it happens in the writing? Curiosity, amazement and loveliness mix with anxiety, and as in Wordsworth's sonnet about the calm and silence of London, viewed from Westminster Bridge in the early morning of the 3rd of September 1802, the very houses seem asleep. There are strange travel agencies. One is no longer at home. As Heidegger observes, the transcendental power of imagination is homeless. Dreaming in literature, the man in this Cixous passage unmistakably resembles the gatekeeper in Kafka's Before the Law, and recalls what is, in some respects, Kafka's signature tune, namely the conviction that the law is fantastic. This passage from Siksu is an embodiment of the new fantastic. The term new fantastic crystallizes something distinctive about writing today. In a Lewis Carroll-y sort of way, I'm tempted to suggest that the uncanny plus the weird equals the new fantastic, or the weird divided by the uncanny equals the new fantastic. At any rate, the new fantastic affirms the inventive, creative, and idiolectic, while also insisting on critical edge. It is a way of thinking about kinds of life writing which don't take for granted and don't encourage the reader to take for granted real factual experience, but kinds of life writing which are, nonetheless, concerned with the dimension of memoir or confession or self-reflection that St. Augustine called making truth. The new fantastic engages with the world's weirding, with injustices and lies and bad stuff of all kinds, but it is not foreign to joy and serenity. It does not renounce pleasure. It reckons with the alien valences of the weird and the negative valences of the uncanny, while propounding the unexpected, a new force of dream, a new way of reading texts, and new possibilities for thinking about the unsettling of distinctions between the fantastic and the real, memoir and novel, fiction and life writing. Initially, I imagined that I'd come up with this term, new fantastic, by myself, as one childishly says. Like a little boy opening a chestnut and being the first person in the world to see it. To see, to smell, to touch, and in a sense to be it. A gorgeous, embryonic tree. A new first-person verb, I, tree. But the new fantastic is already in Svetan Todorov, in the closing pages of his book, The Fantastic, dated September 1968. Attributing a new fantastic to Kafka, Todorov writes, with Kafka, we are thus confronted with a generalized fantastic, which swallows up the entire world of the book and the reader along with it. And then more recently, I discovered that the phrase new fantastic had already been used by Todorov's colleague, Hélène Siksu, in a book review in Le Monde in June 1967. As you seek, so much goes back to Siksu. Keep seeking, you soon discover all the ancient new fantastics, from Sophocles to Shakespeare to Virginia Woolf. I have been speaking of this rather ghostly thing, the new fantastic, from the beginning. For example, in evoking life writing in relation to a tree. Reflecting on poetry, from the quietly shocking confession in The Affliction, when George Herbert pauses to observe, I read and sigh and wish I were a tree. To the dendritic dialogism of Jason Allen Payson's Thinking with Trees, a title rooted in Gemma Deer's remarkable book, Radical Animism, might accompany a reading of Algernon Blackwood's The Man Whom the Trees Loved, under the entry for arboreality, somewhere back there at the beginning of this eccentric dictionary I've been fantasizing about. The Man Whom the Trees Loved is an oblique but deeply thought-provoking narrative about the spooky aftermaths of colonization, deforestation, and Christianity, and a bizarre evocation of a man's queerness, his unhinged and queer absorption into a green, soft sea of trees. Blackwood's story is weird in a gentle, even whimsical way, but I'd like to suggest in closing that its expansive, strange insistence on what Freud in The Uncanny problematically calls primitive forms of animism and anthropomorphism can help illuminate what is going on in an apparently very different contemporary example of the new fantastic, such as Lara Paulson's Spent Light in 2024. Spent Light is simply subtitled A Book. It is a disturbing mixture of memoir and fiction, fantasy and reportage that finds new and surprising resources in the as-if, in tropes of resemblance and in animism and anthropomorphism. It is composed of fragments, episodes, reminiscences, snatched impressions. It resembles the poetry of Francis Ponge in its ethical commitment to putting its paws on objects, a toaster, a broom, a toilet bowl, but only with a view to freeing them, letting them speak, feel, respond, interact. Not so much to articulate their thingness, as in Ponge, but rather to declare their roots, like trees, their branches and ramifications, to allow us to feel their histories, to recall atrocities and inequities and structures of terror and injustice that inform the everyday in a new fantastical form of life writing. Here is just one example for thinking about the central heating. When I press one of my fingers into the soft, spongy teat that barely protrudes from the plastic casing of the thermostat, I am calm. These buttons, so small and unobtrusive, so pleasing to touch, like velvet merged with rubber, like the tip of the tragus at the front of your ear. Shouldn't they be awkward and ugly and heavy to lift? Shouldn't they be so hard to handle that every time you think to turn up the temperature, you must consider whether it's worth cranking your body out of the sofa and staggering towards the machinery in the hallway to wrestle with a lever that is rusting and stiff? Shouldn't the handle be covered in slime, composed of the sweat and the spit, the bogey and shit, collected from the bodies of those who scoop up the profits from the fossil fuel firms they control? Shouldn't these excretions include a droplet of Vladimir Putin's palest semen, diluted with a dribble of Donald Trump's, a squirt of Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud's? And if you dare turn up your heating, if you accept the invitation on the flip down flap to change desired temperature, shouldn't the stink of this substance stay inside you for long days and deprived nights, no matter how vigorously you scrub your hands with mechanic soap and Brillo pad, no matter how often you gargle TCP? Thank you.
Would you like to come and sit here?
If I do, I might fall asleep.
You may stay standing if you wish. It's up to you.
I don't mean to be rude, but I may find myself losing energy if I sit down.
Absolutely, that's fine.
Keep me on my toes.
Okay. All right. In which case?
So I thought I'd start off with a question about your teaching of the uncanny and the weird. To what extent can we teach the uncanny and the weird? How do you do it? How do you go about it?
Thank you. Yeah, that's that is a huge couple of questions, and I should say I've never taught the weird. So one of the things that I was trying to offer a narrative of in this talk was the fact that the weird, I use the word, it's there, but I've never singled out that concept for a pedagogical purpose. How to teach the uncanny, I don't know. I mean, I usually do so in relation to a chapter from a book like the Introduction to Literature, Criticism and Theory, or the introduction to the book called The Uncanny with Freud's essay. I try to encourage people to read Cixous' Fiction and Its Phantoms, which is a difficult but superb text. Sometimes Sam Webber's Remarks on the Sideshow. Yeah, I mean, but I suppose my experience of teaching has generally been in relation to texts, literary texts. So I always would have some kind of, whether it's poetry or a piece of fiction or a novel. And then on occasion down the years I have also fairly regularly brought film in, and sometimes music, and sometimes field trips, so kind of going out into a landscape. With film, although I'd be very interested, I suppose, in doing a seminar where I'm looking at a whole range of film, I suppose I've tended to go for quite straightforward, accessible movies like The Truman Show or Groundhog Day, and use those to kind of unpack some of the thinking of the uncanny.
Thank you. And so you've written about this previously, about how you've been teaching that very course, those seminars on the uncanny for many years. Do you think that a course on the uncanny in an age of university where we're demanded to name ourselves, to identify ourselves, to not delve into the unknowns of deconstruction of the uncanny, is that still possible today to teach a course on the uncanny?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I stopped teaching at the University of Stirling, Sussex in 2022. I was teaching the uncanny the year before, the sort of penultimate year at Sussex. It did then, and it always has, brought in very good student numbers. Sometimes to an embarrassing extent where you have to get another tutor who maybe doesn't really want to teach the uncanny, but they have to come on board to be part of the team. So it's something that, in my experience, has always been popular with students. I remember sort of somewhere maybe around 2018, I started a new course on literature and the environment, thinking that this would be really popular with students, but actually it only brought in, 10. So I don't know. For me, the uncanny, as is obvious from what I've just been saying, continues to follow me around. I can't do anything about it. It's been following me around today, this afternoon, and it will continue to do so, I suppose. And I think it's something that students can quite readily see is a way of opening up all sorts of questions about knowledge, but also about non-knowledge, about the unconscious, about what we can't know, but also about what we don't currently know, but might know.
And to what extent do you think the university is open to those conversations? And I speak the university in general, not this one specifically.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't think it's ever been a particularly sort of thrilling module title for senior management. I've never heard a senior manager say to me, "That sounds like a great course." But then I think it's about, I think it's kind of more for students than senior managers.
Of course. Thank you. I'd like to pass out any questions from our audience here.
I was just wondering whether you think that as children we are born with a greater ability to respond to the uncanny and the weird, and it's gradually educated out of us, typically as we become older. I'm thinking particularly of Maurice Sendak's brilliant book, Where the Wild Things Are. It's also about a boy who steps out from his supper time into something that is weird and uncanny, but also beautiful and fantastic. Do you think we lose that? Was Blake right to feel that we lost a lot of that sense of wonder?
Yeah, thank you very much. I should say that this question is coming from somebody I have known since he was a child. Therefore, I'm having a slightly strange experience of exchange because we played together as boys. Thank you for coming here, Nick.
Is that all? Is it the other Nicholas Royle?
No, the other Nicholas Royle isn't here. I'm pretty convinced. I think he would have announced himself. Yeah, don't get me started on him. I'm happy to talk about it. Yeah, I suppose there are words like wonder, amazement, the marvelous. Maybe they are more readily kind of mapped onto a child. I don't know. The uncanny seems to me to be something that, while it's often to do with childhood, I'm not sure whether it's a childhood experience as such. I think obviously this is going to depend on the example and how we talk about it, but one has to have a certain conception and understanding of the canny or the familiar or of what home or whatever is before that can kind of get transposed or shaken up. I don't know if that's a helpful...
No, interesting way of looking at it. Yeah, thank you.
I wondered if I could take this moment to ask one since I'm holding the mic anyway. Thank you very much for that. What I'm left wondering is, do you feel that you've gotten to a point where you've had this spaniel following you around, or these three-headed spaniels following you around, that you've invested them with so many meaning, you've hung so much meaning on these two words, that perhaps you've made them such a broad church that they've become unwieldy, and you can no longer actually do things with these words because it's hard to do something with the broad church. It's hard to be precise.
Yeah. I mean, the three-headed spaniel is about the weird.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to sort of talk about something that seems to me to have happened, and that writers like Harrison are talking about. Some kind of swallowing up of the world. But yes, I mean, to go back to Ellery's initial question, I mean, how you teach a seminar on the uncanny, for me, it's always felt like, like being a trapeze artist, doing some kind of tightrope thing, because you absolutely can't allow it to become just the kind of go-to term, or at least that's the desire. And then, of course, it's what happens. So inevitably, in the course of a seminar, over a term, semester, there is this kind of U-word fatigue, or this hollowness and kind of stupidity that emerges in the way that this gets bandied about, and you have to somehow try and bring it back, because actually there isn't any uncanny that's not surprising. There's got to be some kind of surprise, which is partly why I tend to think of it as a reading effect. So, you might read whatever it might be, you might read something on the understanding or supposition that it's going to be uncanny, and you don't find it uncanny at all. But then you might put it down and pick up, something else, and that feeling will arise. So I think that sense of the non-programmable is important to my thinking of the uncanny, and of course that's also something that doesn't go well with senior management. if you're trying to do learning outcomes, for instance. Yeah. Yes, there's a question from...
This sort of follows on from Charles's question. Your mentions of Kafka make me think of work that I've done on the phenomenon of the Kafkaesque, both as a quality of Kafka's writing and also as a phenomenon that's become unmoored from his writing. And in the empirical arm of the work that I did, a lot of the definitions that people gave of the Kafkaesque had a sort of duality in them. It's compelling, but it's unsettling. It's completely ordinary, but it's incomprehensible. It's just how it is, but it can't possibly be, and so on. And of course, it can get quite predictable and quite cliche to just talk about opposing dualities all the time. But I wonder how much you see these three concepts either all together or separately as sort of being made up of these opposites that we can't quite get to cohere.
Yeah, the concept of uncanny, weird, and new fantastic. Yeah. I'm not sure. And whenever I've taught Kafka, I've been very struck by that kind of, you're not allowed to ask in a seminar or a classroom, do you believe in God? Right, that's not a question that you ask. But whether you find Kafka funny seems to me to be deeply revealing of a person. So you, I'm sure, know that Kafka writing, when he would read a piece of his out loud to a friend or whatever, he would sometimes just be rolling around on the floor, laughing uncontrollably. For me, Kafka is funny, and I find it quite kind of, I don't quite, it's a different sort of relationship that I have with somebody who says they don't find Kafka funny. But I respect the fact that you can not find Kafka funny. But something is not happening, I think, when somebody doesn't see that this does have a kind of strange comic dimension.
So when I think about weird, I usually think of it as opposed to what is normal or what is conventional. And so I was wondering how you think about this concept as it travels to different cultures, because what I find weird, someone else might find completely normal, and how that might affect how people understand weird in their own situation, whether you've looked across cultures that way.
Yeah. Obviously, what I've been talking about has been deeply Anglophonic. So I'm, forgive me my monolingualism or whatever, but I'm trying to think about it in relation to English, which is the language that I suppose I feel least incompetent to speak about, to write about, to read or whatever. But it is, if we stay with this word weird, I mean, obviously the question of translation is deeply interesting and profound, and would be a whole, other study. But if we stay with the word weird, I guess one of the things I was trying to get at in the talk is the sense that each one of us has their own. And maybe we haven't thought about what it means to say you've got your own weird. Or, maybe you never finish thinking about what your own weird is. But there is this kind of, whether we think of it as an idiom or some kind of, if you like, autobiographical specificity that goes with thinking about weird for you in your own solitude, in your perhaps weird solitude. That's so that there is that kind of experience. That's partly what I'm trying to get at with this idea of idiom and idiolect. How one reckons with it, and then how one perhaps writes about it. And certainly, for me, that would include writing about it without using the word. So I think, one could certainly suggest that some of the weirdest texts are texts in which the word weird doesn't appear, and in a similar way. I mean, Edgar Allan Poe is often kind of cited as the uncanny, early 19th century writer. But he hardly, I think maybe once in a letter, uses the word uncanny. The word doesn't appear. It's not in his idiolect.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe two. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question says that do you think weird is a positive feeling or it is a negative feeling? For example, a positive one is I am here and I want to feel weird feeling or others. And the negative one is that I just sit down here and I receive the feeling weird. So which one is positive or it is negative? I'm not so sure whether I explain it clearly. Thank you.
Right. If I understand you rightly, I think one of the helpful things about Mark Fisher's work is the emphasis that he gives to thinking about the weird first of all in terms of a sense of wrongness. Right. So I think it seems to me that he's touching on something significant when he makes that claim. Something is weird, there's a certain wrongness, he suggests. There's a kind of, it involves us in thinking about wrongness. And then the other thing that I think Fisher helpfully illuminates is the idea of weird as having to do with the outside. I mean, I think it's problematic, and there are various ways in which I do sort of take issue with Fisher, but broadly speaking, his notion of the weird is about the outside, and his conception of the uncanny is about something inside. A bit like, Kant talking about the sublime. The sublime is not in nature, it is in ourselves. You might think of the uncanny, it's not in nature, it's in ourselves. That emphasis is there in Fisher. I know that there is a question here in the front row. I don't know if you missed.
It was something that was forming right the way through from Larry's question to ask you something, and also because you cite Moten.
I can't hear you at the back.
Can you not?
No, I think you might need to stand up.
Would you like me to stand up?
Or repeat the question at the front.
Yeah, it was to do with the uncanny and social. That was what I was wanting to ask, and I was returning to the fact that Nick had mentioned Fred Moten, who's a thinker of the social, and as I listened to the question about teachability, or the question about where the wild things are, where the book is shared, and Nick's answer was suggesting that possibly the adult reading to the child might be having a different kind of experience from what the child was experiencing, and I suppose the thought was about the social and the idiolect and the uncanny is a way of rethinking the social.
Yeah. Thank you, yeah. I mean, it's a wonderful question that we should all think about. My knowledge of Moten is slender. I'm finding my way through this and that, but I like this kind of characterization of Moten as the weird poet philosopher. I think there's an interesting weirdness in Moten which he affirms in his work. I nearly used the phrase when I was writing this. I nearly took to using the phrase soft weird, but I'm trying to think about a way of, maybe something like that in order to get to a more socially, to illuminate the social in some way. I'm still thinking on that one. I'm in my work on Virginia Woolf at the moment. I have become possibly quite crazily interested in the idea of telesthetic communism. So my answer to your question would be, yeah, it's what I call telesthetic communism, but I haven't yet published that book, and it's still kind of in process. So thank you.
I'm afraid
we're going to have to wrap up after this evening, but thank you so much for your wonderful questions. Thank you to Nick for an absolutely just brilliant talk. Please do join us at the back. We'll have a book sale and a wine reception, so come join us, have a chat, and I'll also be here if you'd like to talk about the Global Majorities Programme. Thank you again so much.